The leader of Iran's Islamic Revolution has set out conditions for European signatories if they want Tehran to stay in the 2015 nuclear deal. Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei has said the three European states must protect Iranian oil sales from American pressure and continue buying Iranian crude from Iran. He added that European banks must safeguard trade with Tehran. Iran's leader also noted that the European countries must promise they will not seek new talks on Iran's ballistic missile program and its activities in the region. Ayatollah Khamenei also said Europeans must submit an anti-America resolution at the United Nations Security Council and must protest the U.S. withdrawal from the nuclear deal as a violation of Resolution 2231. Iran's leader added if Europeans fail to meet Iran's demands, Tehran has the right to resume its suspended nuclear activities. Well, joining us live now from Bristol is Tony Gosling, who is an investigative journalist. Tony, what do you make of the demands of Iran's leader? Of course, we had those U.S. demands come out a few days ago.
Well, I don't necessarily think this is the wisest thing for Rouhani to have done, because actually it may be that the Europeans were going along with this kind of idea anyway, and it's not the best kind of diplomatic language to say either you better do this or else. I think a better plan really would be to try and divide and rule when it comes to the United States and the European countries. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, is something that the Europeans genuinely do want to keep. The only trouble is the Americans are basically trying to start a world trade war, and I think the best thing to do would be to sort of allow the Americans to almost isolate themselves through the stupidity of trying to force the Europeans' hand. I think the European countries largely can be trusted, and these 7 conditions might actually just wind the European countries up a little bit. I think also the Iranians are in a very strong position because the European countries do want the Iranian crude oil, and I think a gentle sort of word in their ear saying, look, if you go along with what the Americans want, obviously we're going to cut off the oil. But look, in the background to all of this, we've got an enormous ramping up of tension that's happened. And I think it's become clear to everybody that Donald Trump and his promises that he made the year before last in the presidential election campaign are out of the window. It looks to me as if the deep state and the Israel lobby, that's AIPAC and organizations like that, are basically dictating policy. Now we've got Mike Pompeo reading out these list of demands from the Israelis, potentially. Very similar sounding demands to the sorts of demands that have been made on Qatar. You know, telling a country who it's allowed to have diplomatic relations with, I don't think is very good diplomatic language. And I'd like to see Rouhani being a little bit softer on the Europeans.
Well, Tony, I'm wondering, though, because so far we know that Iran hasn't really seen as much of the benefits as it had been promised in the deal. This is even before Trump walked away from it. Doesn't Iran have the right to be suspicious of the Europeans at this time as well, as they haven't yet been able to give Iran really those benefits?
No, look, I totally understand why the Iranian leadership is worried about maybe not being able to trust Europe, because, of course, one of the things that binds America and Europe together, which people often forget, is these multinational corporations, these transnational corporations, which are very much powerful in Europe and the United States, very often lobbying both Washington and Brussels and London, by the way, the same companies. So I think that the best way, I think always, though, is to not to try and browbeat and badger. It's to use diplomatic channels, gentle diplomatic channels. And let's not forget, we've now got a British embassy in Tehran, which we didn't have for several years. To use those sorts of channels to make peace agreements, really, and good trade agreements, because it's trade which gets countries friendly and actually stops war. And what we're seeing in the Middle East at the moment is an enormous effort by the Israelis to ramp up tension. And I think Rouhani would be well advised not to do that, to actually try and stay back from tension, because we're seeing the move of the capital, the attempted move of the capital in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Even in the news yesterday was the potential demolition of the Dome of the Rock, which would be enormously inflammatory. And this is exactly what Israel and the fundamentalist Zionists in Israel want. which is to ramp up a possibility of war. So I think we need to be really careful in trying to make sure that good diplomatic relations between Europe and Iran are maintained to avert that war.
Very well, Tony. We'll leave there at that. But of course, as always, we appreciate you taking your time out to speak to us.